In the unforgiving wilderness of Big Bend National Park, a veteran ranger vanished during a routine patrol after leaving his service radio behind. The ensuing search yielded nothing but his locked patrol vehicle, and for 2 agonizing years, the desert held its silence as the case went cold. Then, 2 teenagers exploring a forgotten mineshaft 30 miles away found his revolver in a place it never should have been, and the fact all 6 chambers were empty shattered the official theory, revealing the first clue to a much darker truth. The realization that Park Ranger Ronan Wallaby was missing didn't begin with a frantic call or the discovery of an accident scene. It began with a silent charging dock. On August 5, 2020, the relentless Texas sun was finally beginning to dip below the Chisos Mountains, casting long, distorted shadows across the vast expanse of Big Bend National Park. At the Panther Junction Ranger Station, the central hub for park operations, the evening shift change was underway. Radios were being swapped, reports filed, and the quiet hum of administrative wrap-up filled the air. It was routine until it wasn't. Ronan Wallaby, a 61-year-old veteran of the National Park Service, hadn't checked out. In a park spanning over 800,000 acres of some of the most rugged and remote terrain in the continental United States, delays were common. A ranger might be held up assisting a stranded motorist, navigating a difficult trail, or simply taking a moment longer than expected to return from a distant patrol sector. Initially, the supervisors on duty assumed a minor delay. Ronan knew the park better than almost anyone. His experience was a bedrock of the station's operations. But as the minutes stretched toward an hour, a routine check of the equipment logs revealed something that instantly shifted the atmosphere from mild concern to sharp anxiety. Ronan's portable radio, his lifeline in the desolate wilderness, was still sitting in its charging dock inside the station. For any ranger, venturing into the field without a radio was a significant breach of protocol. For a ranger with Ronan's decades of meticulous service, it was unthinkable. This wasn't an oversight. It felt like a glaring red flag. Supervisors immediately attempted to reach Ronan on his personal cell phone, but the call went straight to voicemail. Unsurprising, given the notoriously spotty coverage across much of the park. The immediate priority became locating his last known whereabouts. Investigators began interviewing the rangers who had been on duty that afternoon. Ranger Vaughn Hopper was identified as the last person to have spoken with Ronan. Hopper, a colleague with several years at Big Bend, recounted a brief interaction late in the afternoon. According to Hopper, he had received a report, relayed through the main dispatch, of unauthorized campfire smoke spotted near the remote Mariscal Mine area. The Mariscal Mine, an abandoned mercury extraction site, was located in one of the most isolated sections of the park, close to the Rio Grande. Hopper explained that the shift was winding down and the report was minor, but protocol dictated it needed investigation. Ronan, overhearing the details, had apparently volunteered to handle it. Hopper recalled Ronan mentioning it would be a quick check, a final patrol loop before heading back to Panther Junction to sign off. When questioned about the radio, Hopper suggested that Ronan seemed unusually rushed, perhaps preoccupied with getting out to the site and back before the sun set completely. In that rush, Hopper surmised, Ronan must have simply forgotten to grab the radio from the dock. It seemed a plausible explanation even for someone as experienced as Ronan. With a probable location established, patrol units were immediately dispatched toward the Mariscal Mine access road. The drive itself was long and arduous, requiring high-clearance vehicles to navigate the unmaintained dirt tracks. The August heat, even after sunset, remained oppressive, clinging to the landscape. It was deep into the evening when the search units located Ronan's patrol vehicle. It was parked near the entrance to the old mining area, pulled off the track in a manner consistent with a standard patrol stop. The vehicle was locked. Flashlights cut through the heavy darkness, illuminating the dusty exterior and the immediate surroundings. There were no visible signs of a struggle, no discarded equipment, No tracks leading urgently away from the vehicle. It was simply empty, silent, and offering no clues as to where its driver had gone. Back at Panther Junction, the process of official notification began. Ronan's son, Kalen Wallaby, a police officer residing in Odessa, Texas, was contacted. The news of his father's disappearance, coupled with the detail about the abandoned radio, struck Kalen immediately as profoundly wrong. An official missing person report was filed, mobilizing the resources of the National Park Service Investigative Services Branch alongside state and local agencies. As Kalen prepared to make the long drive to Big Bend, he highlighted a unique detail about his father to the investigators. Ronan was one of the few Rangers in the service who still carried an older model service revolver. Having been grandfathered in when the service transitioned to semi-automatic pistols, Ronan preferred the reliability of the weapon he had carried for decades. It was a detail that defined his old-school approach to the job, and now it was a critical piece of information in the search for a missing armed federal officer. The dawn of August 6th brought the full scale of the challenge into sharp focus. The search and rescue SR operation initiated for Ronan Wallaby was massive, mobilizing resources from across Texas and neighboring states. The focus was the unforgiving terrain surrounding the Mariscal mine. This wasn't hiking territory, it was a labyrinth of dry washes, steep scree slopes, and towering cliffs. The environmental conditions were brutal. August in Big Bend is characterized by extreme heat, with temperatures routinely soaring well above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The air itself felt heavy, a physical presence that pressed down on the landscape. The heat severely hampered the search efforts. Ground teams, clad in protective gear and carrying heavy packs, could only operate for short periods before the risk of heat exhaustion became overwhelming. They moved slowly, methodically, their eyes scanning the shimmering landscape for any anomaly, any flash of color that didn't belong. K-9 units, often the most effective tool in locating missing persons, were largely ineffective. The intense heat evaporated scent trails almost instantly, and the rocky ground, superheated by the relentless sun, was too hot for the dog's paws. The urgency was palpable. The window for survival in such conditions, without water or shelter, was brutally short. Every hour that passed diminished the hope of finding Ronan alive. Air support, including helicopters and drones, provided aerial surveillance, their rotors thundering over the vast emptiness of the desert. But the landscape was so complex, so fractured by canyons and shadows, that spotting a single individual was nearly impossible, especially if that individual was injured or seeking shade. The SAR command post, established near the mine access road, became a hive of activity, buzzing with the tension of a high-stakes operation where time was the enemy. Kalen Wallaby arrived on the second day, bringing with him the focused intensity of a police officer and the desperate anxiety of a son. He immediately integrated himself with the search command, providing insights into his father's habits, his preferred routes, and his extensive knowledge of the park. Kalen was adamant about one thing. His father knew this area intimately. Ronan had spent decades patrolling the most remote corners of Big Bend. He understood the dangers of the desert better than almost anyone. He respected its power. Kalen insisted that his father would not simply get lost, nor would he succumb to the heat or dehydration without leaving some sign, some indication of his direction of travel. If Ronan was injured, he would know how to signal for help, how to maximize his chances of being found. The complete absence of any trace was the most alarming aspect of the disappearance. It suggested something else entirely. While the physical search continued under the punishing sun, investigators began to scrutinize the reason Ronan was in the Mariscal mine area in the first place, the report of unauthorized campfire smoke. This detail, relayed by Ranger Vaughn Hopper, was the catalyst for Ronan's final patrol. In a high-risk fire season, such reports were taken seriously. But as investigators dug into the dispatch logs, they encountered a confounding dead end. The report had been called in anonymously. There was no caller ID, no callback number, and the description of the location was vague, just a general reference to the Mariscal area. Efforts to trace the call's origin proved fruitless. It appeared to have been made from a location that masked its signal effectively. Furthermore, extensive and meticulous searches of the area where the smoke was reported yielded nothing. Teams scoured the ground for any indication of human activity. They looked for footprints, scuff marks, disturbed vegetation, discarded items, anything that would suggest someone had been there. They found no sign of Ronan. Crucially, they also found no evidence of a recent campfire. There were no charred remains of wood, no ash, no soot staining the rocks. The ground was pristine. The conclusion was unsettling. The report of campfire smoke appeared to have been entirely fictitious. This realization cast a dark shadow over the investigation. If the report was fake, it meant Ronan had been deliberately lured to one of the most remote corners of the park. The question was why, and by whom. The realization that the anonymous call couldn't be traced transformed the SR operation into a potential criminal investigation. The proximity of the Mariscal mine to the Rio Grande, the international border between the United States and Mexico, naturally dictated the next phase of the investigation. Big Bend, despite its rugged beauty, is a known corridor for smuggling activity, narcotics, weapons, and sometimes people. The terrain, while difficult, provided cover for those who knew how to use it. Investigators theorized that Ronan might have inadvertently interrupted a smuggling operation. It was a dangerous but plausible scenario. An experienced ranger appearing unexpectedly could have prompted a violent reaction from smugglers desperate to protect their cargo. This theory gained significant traction when a specialized Border Patrol tactical unit, BORTAC, assisting in the search, discovered a substantial recently abandoned smuggler's cache hidden in a deep wash several miles from the Mariscal mine. The cache was typical of cartel operations: large quantities of bottled water, non-perishable food, discarded clothing, and rudimentary camping gear. It was a way station, a place for smugglers to rest and resupply during their journey north. The discovery caused a massive diversion of investigative resources. The area around the cache was processed as a crime scene. Every item was cataloged, analyzed for fingerprints, and scrutinized for any connection to the missing ranger. The prevailing theory solidified. Ronan had stumbled upon the individuals using this cache, and they had abducted or killed him. The mood among the investigators darkened. Confrontations with organized smuggling groups rarely ended well. For several weeks, the investigation focused almost exclusively on this lead. Intelligence analysts worked to identify the specific organization responsible for the cache, tracking movements and analyzing known smuggling patterns in the region. It felt like they were close to a breakthrough, that the answer lay within the complex web of cross-border criminal activity. However, the forensic analysis of the cache eventually delivered a decisive blow to this theory. The forensic teams concluded, based on the degradation of the food items, the accumulation of dust and debris, and the lack of recent environmental disturbance, that the cache had been abandoned several days, perhaps even a week, before Ronan disappeared. The footprints found at the site were degraded and inconsistent with activity on the day Ronan vanished. The cache was unrelated to his case. It was a frustrating realization. Weeks of intensive investigation had led to a dead end. The trail, which had seemed so promising, evaporated like water on the desert pavement. With no physical evidence linking Ronan to the cache and no other leads emerging from the vast empty wilderness, the investigation stalled. The massive SAR operation gradually scaled back. The helicopters fell silent, the ground teams returned to their home bases, and the desert reclaimed its secrets. The disappearance of Ronan Wallaby was rapidly turning into a cold case, leaving behind only the unsettling mystery of the fake report and the vast indifferent silence of Big Bend. June 2022. Nearly 2 years had passed since Ronan Wallaby's patrol vehicle was found empty near the Mariscal mine. The case had gone profoundly cold. The initial urgency had faded, replaced by a lingering sense of mystery and loss that haunted the halls of the Panther Junction Ranger Station. For Kalen Wallaby, the absence of answers was a constant ache, a refusal to accept that his father could simply vanish without a trace in the landscape he loved. The wilderness of Big Bend held the secret, but it remained stubbornly silent. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived not through sophisticated forensic analysis or a painstaking investigation, but through the illicit curiosity of two teenagers. Jarek Pasternak and Silas Granholm, both 17, were far from where they were supposed to be. They had driven from El Paso, telling their parents they were camping in the Guadalupe Mountains. Instead, they had headed south to Big Bend, drawn by the allure of the remote and the forbidden. Jarek and Silas considered themselves amateur treasure hunters. They were fascinated by the history of the region, particularly the abandoned mining operations that dotted the landscape, remnants of a time when the desert was exploited for its mineral wealth. They spent their time researching old maps, looking for forgotten sites, hoping to unearth historical relics. On this particular trip, they were illegally camping in a remote section of the Chisos Mountains foothills, an area far from the main tourist trails, characterized by steep slopes, dense vegetation, and the skeletal remains of old mining infrastructure. They were exploring a ravine system when they stumbled upon an unmarked, dilapidated mineshaft. It was barely visible, concealed by overgrown brush and the accumulated debris of decades of neglect. The entrance was partially collapsed, a dark, narrow opening in the rock face that seemed to breathe out cool, damp air, a stark contrast to the early summer heat. It was exactly the kind of place they were looking for. Forgotten, dangerous, and potentially hiding secrets. Using basic climbing gear they had brought with them, ropes, harnesses, and battery-powered headlamps, they prepared to explore the shaft. The entrance was tight, requiring them to crawl through a narrow passage before it opened up into a larger vertical shaft. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust, decay, and damp earth. Their headlamps cut through the absolute darkness, illuminating crumbling timbers, loose rocks, and the unsettling silence of the subterranean world. Jarek went first, his descent slow and cautious. He tested the stability of the shaft as he went, the loose rock shifting beneath his boots. The structure was precarious, groaning under their weight. They reached a lower level, a horizontal drift that extended deeper into the mountain. The floor was uneven, covered in fallen rocks and the remnants of old mining equipment. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the occasional clatter of a dislodged stone. As they moved further into the drift, Jarek's headlamp swept across a pile of debris in a narrow crevice. He paused, his attention drawn to the formation. It didn't look like a natural cave-in. The rocks seemed deliberately stacked, not randomly scattered. The timbers were arranged in a way that suggested they were intended to conceal something. The organization of the debris was subtle, but in the chaotic environment of the abandoned mine, it stood out. "Silas, check this out," Jarek called, his voice hushed in the confined space. They approached the pile, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They began digging, pulling away the loose rocks and heaving the heavy, waterlogged timbers aside. The work was difficult in the confined space, their breathing labored in the dusty air. Beneath the debris, they found what they were looking for, a heavy-duty black plastic tarp wedged tightly into the crevice. It was covered in dirt and grime, but it was clearly manufactured, a modern intrusion in this ancient, decaying environment. The tarp was heavy and awkward to handle. They struggled to pull it free from the crevice, the plastic snagging on the rough rock face. Finally, they managed to wrestle it out into the center of the drift. It was tightly bundled, secured with heavy-duty tape. They cut the tape, their hands trembling with anticipation. What kind of treasure had they found? They unfolded the tarp. Inside, they found not relics of the mining era, but something far more recent and far more unsettling. Neatly folded, despite the grime and the damp, was a park ranger uniform, a tan shirt, olive drab pants, and a distinctive campaign hat. The uniform was immediately recognizable, but it was the object resting beside the uniform that stopped them cold. A heavy, older model revolver. The silence in the mineshaft seemed to deepen. This wasn't treasure. This was evidence. They recognized the potential significance of their discovery. The uniform was official, the weapon serious. They knew they were in a place they shouldn't be, doing something illegal, but the gravity of what they had found overshadowed their fear of getting caught. They carefully rebundled the tarp and began the arduous ascent back to the surface. Emerging into the bright sunlight, the reality of their discovery settled heavily upon them. They hiked back to their campsite, loaded the tarp into their vehicle, and drove until they found a location with cell service. They alerted the authorities, explaining what they had found and where they had found it. The response was immediate. A team of investigators from the National Park Service Investigative Services Branch, accompanied by local law enforcement, rendezvoused with the teenagers and proceeded to the mineshaft. The location was remote, requiring a difficult hike to reach the entrance. The investigators secured the scene, documenting the location and the condition of the shaft. Back at the staging area, the contents of the tarp were meticulously examined. The uniform was processed for forensic evidence. The name tag confirmed the agonizing truth. The uniform belonged to Ronan Wallaby. The weapon was the crucial piece of the puzzle. An investigator, wearing gloves, carefully examined the revolver. It was an older model, exactly the type Kalen Wallaby had described his father carrying. The serial number confirmed it was Ronan's service weapon. The investigator then performed the critical check. He opened the cylinder. All 6 chambers were empty. The discovery was a bombshell, reigniting the investigation and sending shockwaves through the Park Service. But it also presented a baffling paradox. The uniform was intact, the weapon wiped clean, and the location of the discovery was roughly 30 miles across incredibly rugged terrain from the Mariskal mine area where Ronan had vanished. The empty gun suggested a confrontation, but the neatly folded uniform suggested something else entirely. After 2 years of silence, the desert had finally yielded a clue, but it was a clue that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The discovery of Ronan Wallaby's gear in the abandoned mineshaft breathed new life into a case that had long been considered dormant. But the nature of the discovery presented investigators with a series of baffling questions. The evidence didn't align with any of the scenarios that had been theorized in the initial investigation. It didn't suggest an accident, an animal attack, or a typical confrontation with smugglers. It suggested something far more complex and calculated. The first priority was a meticulous examination of the uniform. It was transported to the FBI crime lab in Quantico, Virginia, for specialized analysis. The expectation was that the clothing would reveal the story of Ronan's final moments. If he had been involved in a struggle, if he had been injured, the uniform should bear the evidence. The forensic examination was exhaustive. The fabric was analyzed under high-magnification microscopes, subjected to alternate light sources, and tested for trace evidence. The results were startling in their negativity. There were no bullet holes, no knife cuts, no tears or rips consistent with a violent struggle. Crucially, there were no blood stains, not a single drop of Ronan's blood nor anyone else's. The uniform was in pristine condition, apart from the dust and grime accumulated during its time in the mineshaft. The condition of the uniform suggested something deeply disturbing. It appeared to have been removed and deliberately folded before being wrapped in the tarp and concealed. This implied a level of control, a methodical approach that was inconsistent with a spontaneous act of violence. If Ronan had been attacked and killed, why would his assailant take the time to carefully fold his uniform? It suggested that Ronan was either compliant or incapacitated when the uniform was removed. The neat folding was not a sign of respect, but a chilling display of methodical efficiency. The lack of forensic evidence on the uniform was equally perplexing. The tarp and the uniform had been wiped clean of fingerprints. There were no latent prints, no smudges, nothing that could identify the individuals who handled the evidence. Whoever had disposed of the gear had been careful, professional, and aware of forensic countermeasures. This was not the work of amateur criminals. Simultaneously, the revolver underwent rigorous ballistic analysis. The weapon was confirmed to be Ronan's service revolver. Forensic testing confirmed that all 6 rounds had been fired. This was the first concrete evidence of a confrontation. Ronan Wallaby had discharged his weapon, completely emptying the cylinder. But where and at whom? Residue analysis of the barrel and the cylinder provided a timeline, albeit a frustratingly imprecise one. The analysis suggested the firing had happened around the time of his disappearance, 2 years prior. The degradation of the residue made it impossible to determine the exact date or time, but it confirmed that the shots were not recent. The implications of the 6 shots were profound. An experienced ranger like Ronan would not have emptied his weapon unless faced with a significant threat. He would have fired deliberately, aiming to neutralize the threat. Yet the lack of damage to the uniform contradicted a firefight where he was wearing it. If he had been shot, there would be blood. If he had been involved in a struggle, there would be tears. The evidence simply didn't add up. If he fired all 6 shots, where did the bullets go? And if he wasn't wearing the uniform when he fired, why did he take it off? Was he forced to remove it? The questions multiplied, each one leading to a new layer of complexity. The next logical step was to search the mineshaft itself. If the gear was found there, perhaps Ronan's remains were concealed within the labyrinthine tunnels. A specialized forensic team, trained in confined space excavation and recovery, was brought in to conduct a thorough search of the shaft. The search was difficult and dangerous. The instability of the shaft, the loose rock, and the confined spaces made the operation agonizingly slow. The team had to shore up the crumbling structure before they could safely proceed. They worked in cramped, airless conditions, the silence broken only by the sound of their tools scraping against the rock. They excavated the area where the tarp was found, digging deep into the accumulated debris, searching for any trace of human remains, any missing bullets, any additional evidence that might explain what had happened. The excavation took weeks. The conditions were grueling. The air was thick with dust, the darkness absolute, the danger of collapse ever present. But despite the meticulous effort, the search yielded nothing else connected to the case. Ronan's remains were not in the shaft. The missing bullets were not embedded in the rock walls. The mineshaft was simply a hiding place for the gear, not the scene of the crime. With the physical evidence offering more questions than answers, investigators turned their attention to the geographic divide. The distance between the Mariscal mine area, where Ronan vanished, and the Chisos foothills shaft, where the gear was found, was approximately 30 miles. This distance was critical. It was too far to travel on foot across the rugged terrain, especially without supplies. The geographic separation, combined with the organized disposal of the evidence, strongly implied a sophisticated operation involving motorized transport. Someone had moved Ronan, or at least his gear, from the Mariscal area to the Chisos foothills. This realization shifted the focus of the investigation away from the immediate vicinity of the disappearance and toward the network of roads and trails that connected the 2 locations. The investigators were dealing with an adversary who was organized, methodical, and familiar with the vast empty landscape of Big Bend. They had the means to transport evidence across significant distances, the knowledge to conceal it in a remote, forgotten location, and the discipline to leave behind no forensic trace. The mystery of Ronan Wallaby's disappearance was no longer just a missing person case. It was evolving into a complex criminal conspiracy. The empty gun was a silent testament to a confrontation, but the folded uniform was a chilling symbol of control. The investigation was back on, but the adversary remained invisible, hidden within the vastness of the desert. The realization that Ronan Wallaby's disappearance involved a sophisticated operation capable of moving evidence across the vast expanse of Big Bend and erasing forensic trails forced investigators to recalibrate their approach. The initial theories of a standard smuggling confrontation seemed inadequate to explain the calculated disposal of the gear and the baffling paradox of the empty gun and the folded uniform. This was something more organized, more deeply embedded in the landscape. The investigation began coordinating closely with Border Patrol intelligence, analyzing high-risk criminal enterprises operating within the park. They were looking not just for narcotic smugglers, but for organizations capable of moving more sensitive cargo, organizations that prioritize discretion and control over confrontation. The intelligence analysis identified a critical pattern. Both the disappearance location, Mariscal Mine, and the discovery location, Chisos Foothills Mineshaft, lay adjacent to a particularly rugged canyon system that cut through the heart of the park. This canyon system was known to be used intermittently as a human trafficking corridor. Unlike the main smuggling routes, which were constantly monitored by electronic surveillance and ground patrols, this corridor was utilized by highly organized groups to move people north, avoiding the main border checkpoints. The terrain was brutal, requiring expert knowledge of the landscape and a significant logistical infrastructure. This realization provided a new context for the evidence. Human trafficking operations are characterized by a high degree of organization and control. The victims are valuable cargo, and the organizations involved will go to great lengths to protect their investment and maintain the secrecy of their operations. The evidence was reconsidered in this new light. The removal of the uniform might not have been an act of spontaneous violence, but a methodical process of control. If Ronan had been overpowered and abducted, his uniform would have been removed to check for tracking devices, to eliminate any identifying insignia, and to exert psychological dominance. The meticulous cleaning of the weapon and the tarp further supported this theory. Human trafficking organizations, particularly those operating sophisticated networks, are often characterized by a high degree of operational security and forensic awareness. The investigation shifted its focus to the suspected trafficking corridor. Specialized teams, including BORTAC operators and experienced trackers, were deployed to conduct a detailed search of the canyon system. This was not a standard search and rescue operation. The teams were moving through terrain that was rarely visited, looking for subtle signs of human passage that had been overlooked in the initial investigation 2 years prior. The search was slow and meticulous. The canyon system was a maze of narrow slot canyons, steep slopes, and hidden washes. The teams were looking for any anomaly, any disturbance in the environment that suggested the presence of a sophisticated operation. They navigated extreme terrain, often relying on ropes and climbing gear. They were looking for subtle indicators, disturbed earth, broken branches, discarded items, that would betray the presence of the traffickers. Several weeks into the search, in a narrow slot canyon that was barely wide enough for a person to pass through, they discovered a concealed area that had been used as a temporary encampment. It was hidden behind a false wall of rock and brush, virtually invisible from the main canyon floor. The encampment was small, efficient, and clearly designed for temporary use. There were discarded water bottles, food wrappers, and other debris. But it was the rock face at the back of the encampment that drew the investigators' attention. On a relatively smooth granite rock face, they discovered a cluster of distinct bullet impacts. The impacts were tightly grouped, suggesting they were fired from close range and with deliberate aim. The rock was scarred, the surface pulverized in several spots. The investigators meticulously documented the scene, photographing the impacts and the surrounding area. Then began the painstaking process of recovering the slugs embedded in the rock and the surrounding dense earth. The excavation required precision tools and specialized techniques to extract the bullets without damaging them. The work was slow, conducted under the intense heat of the desert sun. They had to carefully chisel away the rock around the impacts to extract the slugs without damaging the ballistic markings. Finally, after several days of effort, they recovered 6 slugs. The bullets were immediately sent for ballistic analysis. The results were definitive. Forensics confirmed the bullets were fired from Ronan Wallaby's service revolver. The mystery of the empty gun was solved. But the solution presented a new, chilling reality. The tight grouping of the shots confirmed that they were not fired in combat. There was no exchange of gunfire, no indication of a struggle. The shots were intentional and systematic, discharged directly into the rock face. This was not an act of defense, it was an act of neutralization. The realization hit the investigators with brutal force. Ronan Wallaby had been overpowered and disarmed. His assailants, methodical and efficient, had then taken his weapon, transported it to this concealed encampment, and deliberately emptied it into the rock face. They had neutralized the weapon, ensuring it could not be used against them, and eliminating any ballistic evidence that might link them to the crime scene. This discovery confirmed the investigators' worst fears. They were dealing with a highly organized, professional criminal enterprise. The encampment was a way station on their trafficking route. Ronan had stumbled upon their operation, and they had eliminated him with cold, calculated efficiency. The discovery of the neutralized weapon provided a critical link between Ronan's disappearance and the trafficking corridor. But it also highlighted the scale of the challenge facing the investigators. They were hunting ghosts, an organization that moved through the desert, leaving behind no trace, an organization that had the capacity to make a federal officer vanish without a trace. The investigation now had a direction, but the path forward was fraught with danger. The corridor held the key, but the secrets it guarded were dark and deadly. The confirmation that Ronan Wallaby had been disarmed and his weapon neutralized by a sophisticated criminal organization operating within Big Bend galvanized the investigation. The discovery of the encampment and the ballistic match provided a critical breakthrough, but the organization responsible remained elusive. They were experts at moving unseen through the vast empty landscape, utilizing the rugged terrain to their advantage. Knowing they were dealing with a group that relied on logistical infrastructure to support their trafficking operations, investigators initiated a deep dive into all logistical and electronic data from the park area on the day of the disappearance. They were looking for anomalies, any deviation from the normal patterns of activity that might have been missed in the initial investigation in 2020. The assumption was that an operation of this scale must have left some trace, however subtle, in the digital infrastructure surrounding the park. The data set was massive, encompassing park entry logs, traffic camera footage, cell phone tower data, and any other electronic signature that might provide a clue. The analysis was painstaking, requiring sophisticated algorithms and meticulous cross-referencing of disparate data sources. For weeks, the investigative team sifted through the noise, searching for a signal. The breakthrough came not from within the park boundaries, but from the periphery. Investigators began analyzing automated license plate reader, ALPR data, and associated data from commercial vehicle way stations surrounding the park area. They were looking for vehicles that had entered the vicinity of the park before Ronan vanished and left shortly afterward. They discovered a significant anomaly. A supply truck contracted by the Park Service for routine waste removal from remote outposts registered an unusual weight discrepancy on the day of the disappearance. The truck had entered the area early in the morning, following its scheduled route, but when it passed a way station leaving the vicinity of the park late in the evening, shortly after Ronan vanished, its recorded weight was substantially higher than when it entered. This was the opposite of what was expected for a waste removal vehicle. A truck performing waste removal should be heavier when it enters the area, carrying supplies and equipment, and lighter when it leaves, having deposited the waste at a designated facility outside the park or having accumulated waste that was less dense than the supplies it carried. This truck was leaving the area significantly heavier than when it arrived. The discrepancy was not minor, it was substantial, suggesting the truck was carrying a significant load. The implications were immediate and profound. The truck had the authorization to access remote areas of the park, areas that were off-limits to the general public. It was a perfect cover for illicit activity. The weight anomaly suggested that the truck had picked up unauthorized cargo within the park area. Given the timing and the location, the implications were staggering. Investigators scrutinized the truck's logged route that day. The route seemed inefficient, taking the truck near the Mariscal mine area without a scheduled stop there. The deviation was subtle, easily dismissed as a minor inefficiency in the initial review. But in the context of the weight anomaly, it was a glaring red flag. The truck had been in the vicinity of the disappearance at the time Ronan vanished. The truck was traced to a small local contracting company that held the waste removal contract for the park. The company was unremarkable, a small business that relied on government contracts for its revenue. Investigators looked into the driver's schedule that day. He was a local resident with no significant criminal record, seemingly a reliable employee. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was the first concrete lead that pointed toward a specific entity involved in the disappearance. The weight anomaly was a deviation from the norm that could not be easily explained. It suggested a Trojan horse scenario where the traffickers were using legitimate park contractors as cover for their operations. Simultaneously, Kalen Wallaby, who had continued to relentlessly pursue any avenue that might shed light on his father's disappearance, was reviewing his father's personal logs. Ronan kept meticulous notes, documenting his observations, his concerns, and his daily activities. Kalen had reviewed the logs countless times in the past 2 years, searching for anything that might have been overlooked. This time, armed with the knowledge of the trafficking corridor and the potential involvement of a logistical operation, Kalen noticed a series of entries that had previously seemed insignificant. In the months leading up to the disappearance, Ronan had made several notes about the presence of a specific waste removal truck in unauthorized, restricted areas of the park. Saw the waste truck near the old Maverick Road again. No scheduled stop. Driver said he was checking for illegal dumping. Waste truck parked off the main road near the Rio Grande Village. Seemed odd. He had apparently considered it odd, noting the truck's presence in areas where it had no scheduled stops, but he had not considered it criminal at the time. He had assumed it was a minor infraction, perhaps a driver taking a shortcut or using the park for personal reasons. But in the context of the ongoing investigation, Ronan's notes were a revelation. They confirmed that the waste removal truck had been operating outside its authorized parameters in areas that aligned with the suspected trafficking corridor. Ronan had observed the anomaly, but he hadn't understood its significance. The convergence of the weight discrepancy, the inefficient route, and Ronan's own observations provided the investigators with a compelling case for further action. The waste removal truck was no longer just a logistical anomaly. It was the central piece of the puzzle, the means by which the trafficking organization moved its cargo unseen through the vast expanse of Big Bend. The investigation now had a target, and the hunt was on. The convergence of evidence pointing toward the waste removal truck and the local contracting company provided the investigation with the focus it had desperately needed. The realization that the trafficking organization was utilizing a legitimate government contract as cover for their operations was a chilling testament to their sophistication and audacity. Authorities placed the trucking company and the specific driver identified in the 2020 logs under tight surveillance. The surveillance operation was complex, requiring coordination between multiple agencies, including the FBI, the DEA, and the Department of Homeland Security. They were dealing with an organization that had already demonstrated its capacity for violence and its ability to evade detection. The surveillance had to be executed with extreme discretion, utilizing aerial reconnaissance, electronic monitoring, and undercover operatives. The surveillance teams tracked the movements of the company's trucks, analyzing their routes, their schedules, and their interactions with other individuals. The driver, the primary suspect in the logistical operation, maintained a seemingly normal routine, adhering to his scheduled waste removal duties. But the surveillance revealed subtle deviations, brief meetings in remote locations, and a pattern of behavior that suggested he was still involved in illicit activity. The trucks occasionally took circuitous routes, diverging from their official schedules for unexplained periods. They made stops at isolated locations outside the park boundaries, areas with no official business connection. The surveillance eventually led the investigators to the organization's center of operations. They tracked the movements of the company, linking them not just to the park, but to an isolated, large private ranch compound located outside the park boundaries, hidden within the vast, empty expanse of the West Texas desert. The ranch was situated in a secluded valley, surrounded by rugged hills, accessible only by a single dirt road. The ranch was owned by a notoriously reclusive figure, Olin Quaid. Quaid was known to authorities as a wealthy landowner with suspected ties to criminal enterprises, but he had always managed to insulate himself from prosecution. He cultivated an aura of mystery around himself, rarely leaving the compound and conducting his business through intermediaries. The ranch compound was a fortress surrounded by high fences, electronic surveillance, and armed guards. It was a perfect location for a clandestine operation, isolated and secure. The surveillance confirmed that the waste removal trucks were making regular visits to the compound outside their scheduled routes. The activity at the compound was unusual, characterized by the arrival of vehicles at irregular hours and the movement of cargo in and out of a large, converted barn structure located near the center of the property. Based on the 2020 weight anomaly, Ronan's notes, the evidence from the canyon encampment, and the extensive surveillance linking the truck to the compound, a multi-agency task force obtained high-risk warrants for the raid of the compound and the arrest of Olin Quaid and the truck driver. The operation was planned with meticulous care. The compound was large, the suspects were likely armed, and the potential for a hostage situation was high. The raid was scheduled for the early morning hours, utilizing the element of surprise. The task force included agents from the FBI, DEA, Border Patrol, and Texas Rangers, supported by tactical teams and aerial assets. The raid was executed in the pre-dawn hours. A convoy of armored vehicles, supported by helicopters, moved rapidly down the dirt road leading to the ranch. The perimeter was secured, blocking any escape routes. The entry team, composed of heavily armed tactical officers, breached the main gate and advanced toward the central structures. The assault was swift, overwhelming, designed to neutralize the threat before the organization could react. The compound was a sprawling complex of buildings, including a large main house, several barns, and outbuildings. The initial entry into the main house resulted in the swift apprehension of Olin Quaid, who was found in his bedroom, caught completely by surprise. Simultaneously, another team arrested the truck driver at his home in a coordinated operation. The search of the compound began immediately. The focus was on the large outbuildings, particularly the converted barn structure identified during the surveillance. As the teams approached the barn, they noted that it appeared heavily reinforced and soundproofed. The doors were locked and barricaded from the inside. The teams used specialized breaching equipment to gain entry. When the teams breached the doors, they discovered a sophisticated human trafficking way station. The interior of the barn was divided into several locked cells, constructed of heavy-duty metal bars. The conditions were appalling, characterized by filth, overcrowding, and the stench of human suffering. Inside the cells, they found several individuals huddled together in the darkness. They were children and young adults, mostly from Central and South America. They were malnourished, terrified, and showing signs of abuse. They were awaiting transport further north, the next stage in the trafficking network. The discovery confirmed the existence of the trafficking organization and the role of the Quaid Ranch as a central hub for their operations. The rescue teams immediately began providing medical attention and securing their safety. The scale of the operation was staggering, a brutal exploitation of human vulnerability hidden beneath the veneer of a legitimate business. The search of the compound revealed the extent of the organization's infrastructure. They found specialized compartments built into the waste removal trucks designed to conceal human cargo. They found weapons, cash, and communication equipment. But the most critical discovery was made in Olin Quaid's office. Investigators found detailed maps of Big Bend National Park, including confidential park ranger patrol schedules and radio codes. This discovery was a bombshell. It confirmed that the organization had inside help, a source within the Park Service who was providing them with the intelligence needed to evade detection. The organization hadn't just been lucky, they had been warned. With the evidence mounting and the organization dismantled, the focus shifted to the interrogation of the suspects. Olin Quaid remained defiant, refusing to cooperate. But the truck driver, faced with the overwhelming evidence and the prospect of life imprisonment, began to crack. Under intense interrogation, the driver broke. He confessed to his role in the trafficking operation, admitting that they used the waste removal contract as cover for moving people through the park, utilizing the truck's specialized compartments to bypass checkpoints and patrols. He confirmed that the operation had been ongoing for years, generating millions of dollars in revenue for Olin Quaid and his organization. Then came the critical revelation. The driver confirmed their inside source, Ranger Vaughn Hopper. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigative team. Hopper, Ronan's colleague, the last person to see him alive, had been the organization's informant. He was being paid to provide intelligence, divert patrols, and ensure the smooth operation of the trafficking route. The driver revealed the horrific details of the setup. On the day of the disappearance, an active transfer was taking place. A group of migrants was being moved through the Mariscal mine area utilizing the waste removal truck. Hopper, aware of the operation, used the fake campfire report to deliberately send Ronan, his colleague, directly into the operation. The anonymous call hadn't been anonymous at all. It had been orchestrated by Hopper, a calculated move to eliminate a potential threat. Ronan hadn't stumbled upon the operation by accident. He had been lured into an ambush. The realization that Ronan had been betrayed by one of his own, a fellow ranger sworn to protect the park and its visitors, was a devastating blow. The investigation had finally uncovered the truth, a truth far darker and more insidious than anyone had imagined. The arrest of Ranger Vaughn Hopper took place at the Panther Junction Ranger Station, the very place where Ronan Wallaby's disappearance had first been realized. The atmosphere was heavy with betrayal. Hopper was taken into custody without incident, his colleagues watching in stunned silence. The realization that one of their own had orchestrated the disappearance of a fellow ranger was a devastating blow, shattering the trust that underpinned their dangerous work. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence, the confidential patrol schedules found at the compound, the radio codes, and the truck driver's detailed confession, Hopper remained almost completely silent. He didn't deny the allegations, but he refused to provide any details about the organization's leadership, the extent of their operations, or the identities of others involved. His silence was not born of defiance, but of paralyzing fear. He stated only that the organization behind the trafficking was far more dangerous and far-reaching than the authorities understood. He made it clear that he feared them more than he feared prison. While Hopper remained silent, the truck driver, seeking a plea deal, provided the final horrific details of what happened to Ronan Wallaby. He explained that Ronan, responding to the fake campfire report, had arrived at the Mariscal mine area just as the transfer was taking place. He had interrupted the operation, witnessing the migrants being loaded into the specialized compartments of the waste removal truck. Ronan was quickly overwhelmed by multiple armed men, including the driver and other members of the organization. He was disarmed before he had a chance to draw his weapon. His revolver was taken, later emptied at the canyon encampment to neutralize it. He was forced to remove his uniform, a methodical process to check for tracking devices and to exert control. He was then forced into the back of the truck, along with the human cargo, and transported out of the park. The weight anomaly recorded at the weigh station was the result of the added weight of the migrants and of Ronan Wallaby. Ronan was executed later that day at Olin Quaid's ranch. The organization couldn't risk leaving a federal officer alive. The driver admitted to burying Ronan's body on a remote part of Quaid's property. The uniform and the gun were disposed of days later, during a separate trip. The driver explained that they emptied the gun at the canyon encampment to ensure it was neutralized before hiding it in the mineshaft, a calculated move to confuse investigators and divert attention from the actual crime scene. Based on the driver's confession, authorities excavated the indicated site on the ranch. Deep beneath the arid soil, they recovered the remains of Ronan Wallaby. After 2 years of uncertainty, the agonizing mystery was finally solved. Olin Quaid, the truck driver, and Vaughn Hopper were all convicted and received life sentences for their roles in the trafficking conspiracy and the murder of Ranger Wallaby. The discovery of Ronan Wallaby's remains brought a measure of closure to his family, but the betrayal that led to his death left a permanent scar on the tight-knit community of Big Bend National Park.